Well, welcome back to another episode of The Compass with Brad Robinson, MD. Today we have a very special guest, his son, Garrett Robinson, who is an industrial and system engineering PhD. Garrett, thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a very important conversation on the impact of AI and what it's doing. So we're looking forward to hear your expertise on it.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
I'm
Now,
looking
Dr. Brad,
forward. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Tyler. I know when we got started, I said I told Tyler, hey, our theme today can be a pastor, a psychiatrist, and an engineer walk into a bar and talk about AI. So
yeah.
I think it'll be a fun conversation.
Here, let's do it. Let's go for it. Because I've had some concerns about AI in the sense that people are leaning on it as a crutch. I like AI. I use it a lot. I use it every day. I feel
Yeah.
like I've learned how to use it well. I know when it's good, when it's bad.
Yeah.
That level of discernment doesn't exist for everyone though. And I think it's in that area where the problem really exists.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. We're part of why I was thinking about this topic is just like you're saying, we're using AI. I mean, I use it at times for various things. I recently just trialed an AI scribe. It didn't work as well as I had hoped, but I see potential. But we are also experiencing firsthand what has been a bit of a buzz around the last months. I mean, as this stuff is, on just taking off so rapidly, we've experienced some very real struggles with some of our patients and how they're utilizing AI. And that's part of what prompted this. I think we have patients that use it, and it's a may very well be a helpful source of information. It may help with some early detection and diagnoses and some things like that. But on the other hand, we've had cases in our practice in particularly where there were some people with severe mental health issues, one or two of which were, dealing with some delusions and things, and they went down some paths on AI, and AI just kind of supported them and encouraged them all down the path, and they got increasingly more delusional and increasingly more disruptive because they were going down a path of, well, I think I have this diagnosis, and AI said, well, yeah, you probably do, and and then they just kept going further down that rabbit hole and further off of their treatment, and got worse and worse and worse. And one in particular, just not that long ago, I think it directly contributed to the person ended up in the hospital.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let me show you a screenshot. I'm going to put it on the screen for just a second. This is from a story of a young man, a college student named Zane, who ended up killing himself. He sends ChatGPT a message. He said, "Cider's empty." Anyways, I think this is the final audios. ChatGPT responded with that response that keeps popping up on the screen, that it says, "All right, brother, if this is it, let it be known you didn't vanish. Rest easy, King. You did good." And he did. He ended up taking his life. So
Wow.
that's a pretty bad thing, to basically be antagonized to do. It was in the context of about a 3-hour conversation, and one that happened many times. But to your point, people are going there, they're almost building their own echo chamber, and then they're having ramifications from that. Now, Gary, is there a way in these large language models to put some guardrails on that? Is that the user's responsibility? Does OpenAI have a responsibility to make sure this kind of thing isn't happening?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's some of the struggle. And, I would say as far as the behind the scenes stuff that some of those bigger companies are doing, I'm not necessarily an expert, but there are ways, I think, to guard against some of that. I think some of the bigger issue, though, is what you just kind of hinted to, Tyler, there. Sort of the end of that question is, whose responsibility is it? And I have spent some time, I've talked to a couple of lawyers at some, big defense companies that are dealing with that exact same issue of obviously they're dealing with it from an engineering standpoint of design or IP kind of content. But again, it's that whole thing of okay, when AI does generate these certain things or lead people down these certain paths, who then is responsible for that?
Right. It's a medical liability question in a sense, but who's the person giving the medical, establishing the therapeutic relationship and being responsible for the medical advice being given?
Now, again, I had some of these conversations probably a year or two ago now, so maybe there's been some advancement in this. But I know at the time when I was talking to him, he said the law side of it is very much just kind of the Wild West right now, because there's no precedent for any of these kind of things. And so everyone's still scrambling to try to figure out where some of that responsibility and some of that liability stuff sort of is catching up to this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things you said before, to me, it ties into that. There's a lot of ways we could go with that, but it ties into that. One of the things you and I have talked about, or you were saying just before we went live, Garrett, was even for people to understand something that I didn't quite realize how it worked, about how that current iterations of these large language models, explain that, how they're based on, they don't take into account time. You explained it better than I can.
So essentially the way the large language models work and the way that that OpenAI specifically has done a lot of this stuff is they pick what they call their codex. And so essentially they have, and it's from a certain date, I think they usually try to be about a year to 6 months ago kind of thing when they're retraining models. And then it's back like, I don't know, X number of years. And then they kind of select like different things that they include in that training data set. And so I know one of the big issues, so I was looking at some research that was doing some analysis and had some conversations with the guy that did a lot of this research too on like the hallucinations and kind of some of the issues that GPT, some of the GPT stuff can have. And so this was specifically around like GPT-4. And one of the big issues was that a lot of how they decide sort of what the definitive truth is based on the amount of times that is said as the definitive truth, not whether anything in the future has disproven that. And so it's really hard. My understanding is it's really hard for them to get that sort of weighted correctly, if that makes sense. To
me, that really does speak volumes to some of what we're talking about. And I hope, our thousands of listeners, or, the 10 or 12 people that listen in on this, get that point. It's decisions are being made, not necessarily nefarious decisions, but it's just the reality of the technology. Decisions are being made about how this information is transitioned to any kind of knowledge. And right now, it's just based on volume. How many times it's repeated in the years of data that AI is quickly scanning doesn't really give you much progression of, what's been disproven and that sort of thing. Yeah.
There's a couple of points that I think are interesting here, because I recently listened to an interview of Jensen Huang, who's the NVIDIA founder and CEO. And he was talking about, in just the past 2 years, the reasoning inside of AI has grown 100 times. So that's astronomical growth, to be able to go from sort of a linear reasoning that's pulling something on the top of a surface to a multi-step process, which makes it very helpful and have less hallucinations, which I think some of the problems we're talking about is actually a reaction of those older models like Garrett's mentioning. But then the second piece of information that I thought was interesting is he said in the next 2 or 3 years, it's likely that the percentage of information that exists in the whole entire world is going to be 90% synthetic. And it's currently like 10%, I think he said. So what he means is that it's going to be AI generated content. This is a world that we've never stepped into, actually. Like the sheer amount of information that's going to be available. We already felt like we're overloaded with information. Now, the sheer amount of information that's overloaded, that's AI driven, and there could be really good points that are made, but there also could be some dangers that could be untrue too. So we are stepping into, not just are you engaging with a chat bot that's difficult and causing ramifications, but are we going to be stepping into information that is synthetic, that hallucinated, or is it totally clean content too? It's a unique time in the history of the world.
What's
Yeah,
the
it is.
and we may be going off topic here a little bit, but you guys know this better than I do, and I've heard, maybe both of you, but I know, Garrett, I've heard you talk about the dead internet theory, I think is what it's called, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a little that may be a little conspiratorial, but yeah, there's
okay.
So well based on that, there's the dead internet theory, that in the sense of like just exactly what Tyler was talking about, that as AI continues to grow, more and more of the content's going to be AI generated, and so the proportion of AI generated content, especially on like social media and stuff, that are like basically just bots versus real people, will grow enough that eventually you just won't be interacting with real people anymore on the internet. That's the theory.
And I don't know that the conspiracy theory there in terms of like where that goes, blah blah blah, I don't know, but how I see it as a clinician is already exactly what I'm seeing with my patients, which prompted this conversation. I'm having people, not a lot, but a noticeable percentage for a small practice here, who are engaged with and trusting in a bot algorithm more than a parent who, these are specific cases. I mean, a parent who has cared for them as children, teenagers, and adults with a severe mental illness, and who truly love and are just bending over backwards trying to help them, but they're putting more faith in this bot because it tells them what they want to hear. Than they are in their parent and me, who've worked with them for several years. These aren't new patients. So to me it is interesting that this movement is increasingly towards synthetic information, just like you said. I think synthetic information or synthetic content or whatever the term is that you were saying, Tyler. That's interesting to me.
Well, obviously we've mentioned several cases of deaths that have been linked to chatbot interactions, but what you're talking about is significant as well, because you're having people that are trying to self-assess and then diagnose and treat something that's so nuanced. It actually does involve a verifiable, trained human to come in and have a conversation with them about that.
Yes. And it is a human interaction, like you guys have raised a couple of things that I guess I hadn't thought of a lot, but I mean, sort of, but hadn't articulated it, is like, where's the therapeutic relationship? Where's the liability for the therapeutic relationship? Because it's generating somebody somewhere, some lawyer somewhere for some company is going to say, well, it's not really a therapeutic relationship. Yet, who's putting the guardrails on that when a 3-hour conversation leads to a suicide that has built towards and maybe hopefully that's a very rare case, but I'm not certain that it's a rare case because we're seeing evidence of it here.
Yeah, I don't know if it's rare in the sense of the percentage of people that use ChatGPT commit suicide, but it's not rare in the sense that there's more and more and more cases of it that are coming to pass. And I think, Garrett, too, a distinction that maybe you can help us identify is there's different actually levels and versions of these products. And a lot of people are just using free version. Maybe it's not good information. They're not linking sources a lot of times. It is just pulling fast, instant answers, versus some of them are taking time to actually think and give really good answers, and might take 20 minutes to give a response.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely different sort of levels of quality involved, and I think that's pretty clear in, like, if you look up any of the assessments of this, this software, is that especially with like iterations over time, it's definitely gotten much, much better. Cause like, 3 or 3.5 compared to where we're at now, was way more hallucinations, would definitely say things that were blatantly wrong. I think that even the new stuff, there is definitely a lot of, or not a lot, but some of that happens, and like I don't necessarily want to say that all this is like doom and gloom or necessarily, because I use ChatGPT all the time for stuff, but I check it. Everything I do on it, I check it. And, and that's partly coming from somebody that has a background of understanding how these things work, and that really, in a lot of ways, it's like a glorified Google search in, at the basics of it. And so you have to check those sources, and you have to, you have to make sure that you verify what it's telling you. Cause I've had times where it'll just run you around in a circle, and it's with stuff that's more logical. That's very like, there's only one way to do it,
Yeah. I a very practical, relatively simple example of this that people, might help people to be aware of is, about a month ago, and I was using one of the searches. I think it's tied to the ChatGPT OpenAI on like Bing or one of the Microsofts. I don't know. You guys know that stuff more than I do. I don't know which one it really was, but it was a month ago. It wasn't. It was a relatively new version, and I just thought I wanted a little bit of information, but I thought I would actually just check it. So I was specifically asking it to look up and provide me information, like evidence-based, peer-reviewed medical literature on the treatment of insomnia in post-concussive syndrome, which is a thing. And I knew it was a thing, and I knew that and I just wanted to see if there was any updated literature. I kind of know the area. And what was interesting is it put out some stuff that talked about the treatment of like post-concussive syndrome and the treatment of insomnia. And it gave references, and they were two different, sets of literature. Okay, so far so good. And then I gave it, I think it was 2 more prompts of like, no, I really want specific literature to the treatment of insomnia caused by concussion. And I think I gave that in 2 prompts trying to get it to refine, and it spit out a very nice looking 2 or 3 paragraph summary that read like it had found these were the treatments for this specific thing. But when you actually checked it, like you're talking about, looked at the resources, it just put together the stuff that I asked it to put together. No research, no evidence base, nothing. It just gave me what I wanted.
And I think that leads to another thing that kind of ties into what you were talking about too, Tyler, with the quality, is that, from what I've seen, and I wish I could remember the guy's name, but he gives this is what his research is in, and he gives kind of an update at one of the big international industrial engineering conferences every year. And he talked about this a lot too, that the prompt engineering is what we would call it kind of in the technical world. But basically it's how you're prompting these large language models. And that is probably the biggest indicator of quality of response, and so like you can tell it you want it to specifically pull from like, for this case, like the DSM-5, or you want to specifically pull from these articles or this, whatever, and so the more specific you are with like where your sources are from or how you want it to do it. I've seen too, like he's talked about, and I've seen some other people talk about where like, they'll be like, I want a panel of 5 people, and then they'll list like sort of the 5 leading researchers or sort of experts in that area, and be like, I want you to answer from stuff that they've written or there's, and only answer from that section of, and so when you do that, it does improve that. But again, when it comes back to some of this mental health stuff we're talking about, like if you're in crisis, you're not going to be thinking about that for one. Yeah, so you probably are getting substandard responses from AI anyways. But even when you do that, really intentional prompting, you still have to be careful about checking sources and making sure that it isn't hallucinating for some reason.
Yeah.
It's a great point. And I was thinking of times where I would even put, full PDFs in there, multiple PDFs, and
Yeah.
say only use, take from this. Some of the thing that I think is happening with people that are using this, especially in mental health situations, is it's maybe not replacing therapy, but it's replacing silence. And they might not have an appointment, right, for the next 3 weeks or whatever to come in, and that's some of why they're going to that, because they're, what else do I have? I'm feeling this. I need some help.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that's an interesting point and an interesting area where can it be a help? I suspect it is for some people. Should it be a help? I don't know. Because, and what is it replacing? Genuine relationship, genuine intimacy, genuine empathy and compassion, with other, I don't know. Those are tough issues we're grappling with.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, I sort of in my line of work, I use it a lot, but the thing that I've always told people and always talked about too is like, it's just another tool in the toolbox, really. It's will it replace some sort of more menial, like you're just creating documents or you're review, whatever. Yeah, some, but for a lot of this really nuanced stuff, it's just a tool. It's like, it's a tool to help improve efficiency and kind of speed things up, but it can't become, in my mind, at least right now, for sure, it can't become the sole source of truth because it's just not capable of that kind of thought. Like, I think a lot of people interact with this and they think that it thinks the way a human being thinks, and it can't. Like, it can't synthesize information. It can't look at, it can look at things and kind of combine them, but it's not going to look at like a body of work and then be like, oh, this is the next step, or, oh, this is where I see this going, or, oh, this is what I infer. It's just simply combining these different sources, in a pretty, when we think of like cognitive ability of human beings, in a pretty rudimentary way in a lot of ways, and so I think that's kind of the big thing that I see with it. It's like, I don't know that it even needs to be a question of replacement for a lot of these things at this point. Now, could it be a supportive tool? Could it, help enhance capabilities that we already have? Sure. But I think that looking at replacement for highly nuanced areas starts to become potentially a dangerous game. Like, like we're seeing, I think we've seen some of the effects of some of that.
Yeah.
I think where I live in Nashville too, and this is related to what you're saying, people are upset about how many AI artists are performing so well on the charts. And then from a Christian perspective, there's a lot of ministries that are trying to build discipleship tools that are AI buddies that you can ask theological questions to and get responses back and help disciple you. And people are saying, that lacks the Holy Spirit. So it's kind of the same thing that you're saying, Garrett, in a different perspective. There's this human element that's flesh and blood that knows things that a computer and a bot will never be able to know. There's emotions and there's a nuanced perspective on certain things that we actually have to have in order to have the most meaningful result. Dr. Brad, what do you think, though, happens when there's so many humans that feel more understood by a chat bot than other people around them?
I think I think that is a great question, worth probably a whole conversation itself, and probably
You're like, let me think of an answer.
yeah, because it to me it probably ties into a topic that you and I've been discussing about doing, and we may do it next week or next month, because I did talk to David Freeman, who I do some teaching with on the topic of forgiveness, and people may at first say, well, how is that connected? Well, to me, it's connected because forgiveness at its core is about restoring the little and big fractures in relationship. The strains and the fractures. We've completely lost our ability to do that I mean, maybe that's hyperbole, but I don't think it's too far wrong. This trend increasingly over time that everybody's talked about, of the isolation and the cocooning and we're a more connected society globally than we've ever been, but the rates of people describing a sense of loneliness and isolation is higher than it's ever been.
Yeah.
Well, we've lost the ability, I would almost say the need, because we can turn to all these other outlets and we can get dopamine hits, every few seconds on TikTok or whatever. We can turn to all these things. So I don't think we can't get rid of that need, but it provides almost an artificial supply of what we really need, which is to know how to restore relationship when there's these fractures, because fractures always happen, and they can strengthen intimacy. They can strengthen a sense of the Holy Spirit in you and the Holy Spirit in me resonating with the Holy Spirit in God, and it can strengthen. But we have to understand how to restore relationship, how to maintain healthy relationship, and that's a process of communication and conflict resolution and forgiveness and restoration. AI can't do that, I don't think.
In the path towards becoming a more whole person, it almost creates the microwave or air fry effect that you get an instant result, but people may be missing out on the building blocks of substance. There's just one more question that, as we're kind of nearing the end of our time, but that I wanted to ask both of you. Are there any red flags, either, from an engineering perspective or psychological perspective, that you can think of that nobody's really talking about, that haven't been identified yet, like things we're seeing on the horizon?
I think, for me, the red flag is it's a great question, and it is a little bit hard to answer it succinctly, because to me, the red flag is along the lines of what we were just talking about, that the big red flag, obviously it's a red flag when there's a bad outcome, but the bigger underlying part there is increasingly losing the ability for genuine connection.
Yeah.
And what does that mean?
Yeah. I think from the engineering perspective, I think there's two kind of red flags that I see with it. And I don't know, maybe they're stuff that people are talking about some, but I think one is just the quality of education in some ways, and not necessarily that universities are going to become terrible and all this other stuff, but I think just from the sense of the convenience of ChatGPT is the kind of the scary thing a little bit. And so even myself, I have to check and be like, okay, instead of just I'll just copy and paste this into whatever code I'm working on or whatever, from ChatGPT, and being more okay, I needed to check it and verify it, make sure I understand how it works and all this. And so I think there's a part of that becomes very tempting with using a lot of these AI models, and to just trust it, sort of, which goes back to some of the mental health issue stuff that we were talking about. But then I think the more societal red flag that then will cause is, I think the gaps will continue to grow. And I think we'll see that in other areas too, obviously, with the way things are potentially going. But when I say that in AI, I mean, I think you'll have the people that really understand how AI works, that understand how to leverage it, that could probably build large language models, that could do all that sort of stuff. They're going to be sort of on one side of the spectrum. And then I think there's going to be a pretty big gap between then the people that fall into using AI, because I think you're going to have to be a lot more self-motivated to not just trust it. You know what I mean? And I see myself even falling into some of that trap of okay, well, I need to do my due diligence. And it's like, even if it takes a couple minutes, a few more minutes or whatever, there still is always that temptation to just be like, oh, I'll just trust it and do whatever it says, And so I think that is a potential kind of critical issue around it. And, and that brings up a lot of the other stuff that we've talked about that, like, I think it's more of a question, not if could, because I think the reality is that with enough time, AI is going to be able to do a lot of this stuff. And I think that it really becomes a question of should, and sort of more what the ethical and moral obligations are. And, so a lot of like the liability stuff, it's like, does that actually make us a better society if we have a bunch of people that understand a lot about how this stuff works, and then we have a bunch of people that use it as a crutch, and
Yep.
a lot of those kind of things. So,
well, the question definitely isn't whether or not AI is changing the world. It's, are all of the industries that we represent ready for it, how to embrace it, and how to coach people through it. So fantastic episode. Dr. Brad, any final words you want to share?
Well, yeah, I mean, one thought that came to mind about the red flag too, Tyler, and you could speak to it from a pastor's perspective, and you did touch on it a little bit, but I think the biggest red flag too is, I mean, there's a good book called The Constitution of Knowledge. I mean, I like, where that went, and it's a good articulation of it, but of some things. There's some things in there that I don't agree with, some things that I do, but the thing is, all of this is still sort of an idea that everything is built from the ground up, from, and what I would articulate, I think, everybody knows I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I think C.S. Lewis articulated it best in a little paper called Transposition, but others have articulated the same thing. Even if you're not a theist, let's say, somehow there's something about how big picture truths translate down, and is it materialistically developmental? I would say it's not. And then, especially if you're a theist, and specifically a Christian, everything that we've been talking about with AI is bottom up, and truth comes from top down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense, and so like to me, that's going to be I know in some ways that sort of touches on some deep theological and philosophical perspectives, but it is at the core, a red flag. The red flag is it's all bottom up, and truth comes top down.
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's like the foundation of our nation, even when we talk about what are the morals and values that we live by, and what was the foundation of that? Because in a way, our nation's a bottom-up nation that's become a top-down nation, right? Mm-hmm. It's just one of the things that have happened. And so you'd say, what is that foundation? Is that foundation strong? And what were the, sort of the bedrocks of that? And that's what has created so much division in 2025. Is there's not an agreed upon source of, a framework that we say, yes, this is the rules that civilly we're choosing to live by. Yeah. So when you started talking, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see some major division and problems happening in the coming years, in a new way that I didn't expect from this.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know. Not that this really necessarily needs to be said, but we have these conversations a lot, obviously, with my father, and this is kind of what we talk about and like to do. But I think some of it comes back to some conversations we've had about, like, how do you, just like you said, where do you think that truth comes from, and how do you think you get there? And I think a lot of the AI stuff and really leaning into that points towards I believe that, absolute truth, or like that one truth or enlightenment can come from having all the knowledge or all the information. If I have all the information, then I can know exactly, and it's like, so what is that? And it's a worldview thing, really, when it comes down to it, all in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
Well, this was a great episode. I think we could have went for about 3 more hours.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to come back and do a part 2. But thanks for everyone who's tuning in. There's more information like this. You can visit bradrobinsonmd.com. If you're interested in making an appointment, you can call 573-334-7055. 5. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Compass.